They disappeared without explanation, left you questioning your value, your heart, even your sanity. But here is the truth. Nobody tells you when an avoidant finally faces you after a long silence, the mask always cracks. Because silence can hide feelings, but it can never destroy them. And the moment they stand before the person they once avoided, everything they buried begins to rise. There comes a moment in life when silence speaks louder than words. A moment when someone who once ran from connection, from honesty, from emotional responsibility, finally returns. Not because time magically healed them, but because truth has a way of following every soul, no matter how far it runs. You must understand this deeply. People can avoid conversations, avoid vulnerability, avoid accountability, but they cannot avoid themselves forever. The avoidant mind believes distance creates peace. It convinces itself that disappearing is protection. But every ignored emotion becomes a shadow that waits in silence. And eventually, the day comes when they must face the very person they tried to escape. And when that moment happens, something powerful unfolds every single time. They expect to find the same broken version of you, the same person waiting, the same person begging, the same person emotionally starving for closure. But growth changes a human being. While they were running from emotions, you were learning from pain. While they were hiding in silence, you were rebuilding your spirit. While they were suppressing truth, you were discovering your worth. And suddenly, when they face you again, they realize something shocking. You survived the silence they thought would destroy you. That realization shakes them deeply. Because nothing confronts avoidance more powerfully than someone who healed without revenge, someone who found peace without needing validation. This is one of life's divine principles. What we refuse to confront internally will eventually confront us externally. No soul escapes emotional truth forever. The silence they created becomes a mirror, and in that mirror, they finally see the cost of emotional cowardice. They see the love they neglected, the connection they abandoned, the damage caused by fear disguised as independence. But listen carefully. This moment is not about ego. It is not about winning. It is not about making someone regret losing you. It is about awakening. Because life will always teach through consequences what people refuse to learn through wisdom. And when an avoidant finally faces someone they deeply affected, they often encounter a version of that person who no longer needs their approval to feel whole. That is the real transformation. Power is not found in chasing someone who withdraws. Power is found in mastering yourself so completely that their return no longer controls your emotions. Many people think closure comes from explanations, but true closure comes from understanding your value, even without one. You see, emotionally mature people do not run from difficult conversations. They do not disappear when intimacy becomes real. They stay, they communicate, they grow. Avoidance may protect comfort temporarily, but it destroys connection permanently. And this is why the reunion becomes emotionally overwhelming for them. Because deep inside, they know they lost more than a person. They lost a chance to grow beside someone genuine. But your mission was never to save someone unwilling to face themselves. Your mission was to evolve, to become wiser through heartbreak, stronger through abandonment, more peaceful. L through uncertainty. Never forget this. The people who walk away without explanation often return carrying the emotional weight they tried to escape in the first place. Because emotions delayed are never emotions erased. And when they finally stand before you after all that silence, they are not just facing you. They are facing every truth they buried within themselves. So do not fear silence anymore. Sometimes silence is not rejection. Sometimes it is life separating you from people who are not yet ready for the depth you carry. Continue growing. Continue healing. Continue becoming someone whose peace cannot be disturbed by another person's inconsistency. Because the greatest victory is not making someone come back. The greatest victory is becoming so aligned with your worth that whether they return or not, you remain whole, grounded, and unstoppable. Silence is one of the most misunderstood forms of human behavior. Most people immediately assume that when someone pulls away, disappears, or stops communicating, it means they no longer care. But in many situations, especially with emotionally avoidant people, silence is not born from hatred. It is born from fear. Fear of vulnerability, ability, fear of confrontation, fear of emotional exposure, and sometimes fear of themselves. Many avoidant individuals were never taught how to process emotions in a healthy way. They learned survival instead of connection. Somewhere in their life, they discovered that emotions create discomfort, vulnerability creates danger, and attachment creates pressure. So instead of leaning into difficult emotions, they learned to escape them. Silence became their shield. Distance became their defense mechanism. What makes this painful is that the person on the receiving end often interprets the silence personally. They begin questioning their worth. They replay conversations in their mind. They wonder what they did wrong. They search for closure in empty spaces. But the deeper truth is this: avoidance is usually more connected to the avoidant person's internal battle than the value of the person they left behind. Emotionally avoidant people are often overwhelmed by intensity. Genuine connection forces them to confront emotions they have spent years suppressing. Love requires openness. Intimacy requires honesty. Deep relationships require emotional presence. And for someone who fears vulnerability, ability, these things can feel emotionally threatening rather than comforting. This is why silence becomes their escape route. When emotions become too real, instead of communicating confusion or fear, they withdraw. Not because they always want to hurt someone, but because they do not yet possess the emotional tools to stay present during discomfort. They convince themselves that distance will create peace. They believe if they avoid the conversation, avoid the conflict, or avoid the emotional responsibility, the pressure inside them will disappear. But suppressed emotions do not disappear. They simply go underground. Silence may temporarily numb discomfort, but it never resolves the deeper issue. In fact, prolonged silence often intensifies emotional conflict internally. The avoidant person may appear calm on the outside while carrying immense emotional tension within. They distract themselves, they stay busy, they focus on external things, yet somewhere in quiet moments, unresolved emotions continue speaking. This is the tragedy of avoidance. The very thing they run from is often the very thing they secretly crave: genuine connection, emotional safety, and understanding. But for AR creates contradiction. They may care deeply and still disappear. They may think about someone constantly and still remain silent. They may miss the connection and still resist reaching out. To emotionally healthy people, this behavior feels confusing and inconsistent. But to an avoidant person, silence feels safer than emotional exposure. The problem is that silence creates wounds on both sides. The avoidant person remains trapped in emotional suppression, while the other person carries confusion, pain, and unanswered questions. Communication could bring clarity, but fear prevents it. And when fear controls communication, relationships begin collapsing under the weight of assumptions and emotional distance. This is why emotional maturity is so important. Mature individuals understand that discomfort is not something to escape, it is something to navigate with honesty and courage. Real growth happens when a person learns to sit with difficult emotions instead of running from them. Because silence cannot heal what honesty refuses to confront. Eventually, avoidance catches up with every person. Human beings are emotionally designed for connection, truth, and expression. No amount of distraction can permanently silence unresolved emotions. Over time, the emotional weight grows heavier, regret grows louder, reflection becomes unavoidable, and many avoidant individuals eventually realize something painful. The silence they used to protect themselves also pushed away people who genuinely cared for them. This realization often arrives late, after distance has already changed the relationship. Because people who endure long periods of silence begin transforming. Pain teaches them lessons. Absence forces them to grow stronger. They slowly stop chasing answers and start rebuilding their sense of self. That is why silence should never automatically be interpreted as proof of hatred or lack of care. Sometimes silence is simply the language of emotional fear, a language spoken by people who have not yet learned how to face vulnerability without feeling threatened by it. And understanding this truth changes everything. It allows a person to stop internalizing another person's avoidance as a reflection of their own worth. It creates compassion without self-destruction. It brings wisdom to situations that once only created confusion. Because another person's inability to communicate openly does not diminish your value. It only reveals the depth of healing they still need within themselves. Avoidant people often believe that leaving creates freedom. They convince themselves that distance will quiet their emotions, reduce pressure, and restore control over their inner world. When feelings become too intense, when intimacy starts demanding vulnerability, or when emotional responsibility begins to feel overwhelming, their instinct is not to move closer, it is to retreat. Running feels safer than staying. But what many people fail to understand is this: distance can separate bodies, but it cannot erase emotional truth. An avoidant person may stop replying. They may disappear for weeks or months. They may distract themselves with work, entertainment, new environments, or even new relationships. Yet none of these things truly eliminate what was emotionally real, because emotions that are suppressed do not die. They wait. This is the hidden struggle of avoidance. On the surface, it can appear as though the avoidant person has moved on easily. Their silence may seem cold, detached, or unaffected. But internally, emotional memories often remain active far longer than people realize. Human beings are not machines capable of deleting meaningful emotional experiences at will. What was once deeply felt leaves an imprint. The avoidant person tries to escape discomfort by avoiding reminders of emotional intensity. But the mind has a strange way of preserving unresolved feelings. Small moments begin triggering memories unexpectedly. A familiar place, a song, a quiet night, a random thought, and suddenly emotions they believe they buried begin resurfacing. This happens because emotional truth does not depend on physical proximity. A person can leave the relationship while still carrying the emotional weight of it internally. The deeper the connection was, the harder it becomes to erase its impact. Many avoidant individuals confuse temporary emotional numbness with healing. They think silence means closure. They believe that if they stop talking about something, they have escaped it. But silence is not resolution. Silence is often emotional postponement. True healing requires confrontation, reflection, honesty, and emotional processing. Without those things, unresolved emotions continue operating beneath the surface. The person may appear functional externally while internally carrying confusion, guilt, longing, or regret they do not fully understand. This creates an exhausting inner conflict. Part of them wants connection. Part of them fear it. Part of them misses the person. Part of them fears vulnerability. Part of them wants to return. Part of them fears facing the emotional consequences of their disappearance. And this internal contradiction is why avoidant behavior often appears inconsistent. Their actions may not align with their emotions because fear interrupts emotional expression. The heart remembers what the mind tries to suppress. That is why emotional truth always finds a way to surface eventually. A person can distract themselves for a season, but unresolved emotions often grow louder in silence. What they avoided externally begins confronting them internally. They replay conversations. They think about what they should have said. They remember the safety, care, or connection they once had, but could not fully receive because fear kept them emotionally guarded. And sometimes the most painful realization arrives when they understand that the person they distanced themselves from was not the threat that their own fear of intimacy was. This realization can deeply shake an avoidant person because it forces them to face something uncomfortable. Running protected them from vulnerability temporarily, but it also cost them genuine connection. The human soul naturally longs for authenticity, closeness, and emotional understanding. No matter how independent someone appears, emotional truth continues existing beneath the surface. People can suppress emotions, but suppression is not the same as freedom. Eventually, life creates moments where emotional truth becomes impossible to ignore. Loneliness exposes it. Reflection exposes it. Growth exposes it. And often, seeing the other person moving forward peacefully becomes one of the strongest emotional mirrors of all. Because the avoidant person begins realizing that while they were running from emotions, The other person was learning from them, growing through them, and transforming because of them. This is why emotional truth cannot be permanently escaped. Time may create distance, but distance alone does not create healing. Real healing only happens when a person becomes emotionally honest with themselves, when they stop using silence as protection, action, and start confronting the fears hidden underneath it. And one of the deepest truths about avoidance is this: the emotions people run from often follow them longer than the emotions they face directly, because pain confronted can heal, but pain avoided tends to linger. That is why emotional truth remains powerful, no matter how much silence surrounds it. Silence may delay confrontation, but eventually the heart forces every person to meet what they tried to outrun. When an avoidant person finally returns after a long silence, most people expect words to reveal everything. They wait for explanations, apologies, or dramatic confessions. But the truth is, the most powerful thing revealed in that moment is rarely spoken. It is felt. Their energy speaks before their mouth ever does. Human beings communicate far beyond language. Eyes reveal tension. Body language reveals hesitation. Presence reveals emotional weight. And when someone who spent months avoiding emotional confrontation finally stands before the person they disappeared from, their internal world often becomes visible in subtle but undeniable ways. This is why reunions with avoidant people carry such emotional intensity. The silence may have hidden their thoughts, but it could not erase emotional memory. And when they return, unresolved emotions begin surfacing through nervous energy, emotional inconsistency, guarded behavior, lingering eye contact, or strange moments of vulnerability they struggle to control. Sometimes they appear calm, but their energy feels unsettled. Sometimes they try to act casual, but their attention exposes deeper emotion. Sometimes they avoid difficult topics completely, yet their presence alone carries emotional heaviness, because energy cannot fully hide what the heart still carries. Avoidant individuals often spend long periods trying to maintain emotional control. They suppress feelings because vulnerability feels unsafe to them. They rehearse emotional detachment so they can avoid discomfort, but real emotional connection weakens emotional masks. And when they come face to face with someone connected to unresolved emotions, maintaining that mask becomes difficult. This is why their behavior can suddenly become confusing. They may reach out indirectly. They may test the emotional atmosphere cautiously. They may become unusually quiet. They may stare longer than usual. They may appear emotionally distant one moment and emotionally present the next. These contradictions are not random. They reveal internal conflict. Part of them wants connection. Part of them fears losing control emotionally. Part of them wants to express what they feel. Part of them fears the vulnerability required to express it honestly. And this battle reveals itself through energy long before words become clear. One of the most revealing moments happens when the avoidant person realizes the other individual has changed. They expected to return to someone emotionally desperate, broken, or waiting endlessly for answers. Instead, they encounter calmness, growth, confidence, or emotional stability. That shift affects them deeply, because energy responds to transformation. When someone who once chased them now stands peacefully in their own worth, the emotional dynamic changes completely. The avoidant person suddenly feels something unfamiliar. They are no longer emotionally in control of the connection. This can create visible discomfort because avoidant individuals often rely on distance to regulate emotional intensity. But when the other person no longer reacts with desperation or emotional dependency, the avoidant person loses the emotional structure they were used to. And in that moment, their true feelings often begin leaking through their behavior, not always through direct confessions, not always through emotional speeches, but through subtle signs, lingering presence, unexpected softness, hesitation to leave, emotional nervousness, curiosity about your life, or emotional sensitivity they struggle to explain, because genuine emotions always influence energy. This is why emotionally aware people pay attention not only to words, but to emotional consistency and presence. Words can be rehearsed, explanations can be controlled, but energy often exposes emotional truth unintentionally. An avoidant person may say they are unaffected, yet their behavior reveals emotional attachment. They may claim distance helped them move on, yet their nervousness around you suggests unresolved emotions still exist. They may avoid discussing the past entirely, yet their emotional reactions reveal that the past still lives inside them. The body often reveals what the ego tries to suppress, and this is why silence does not guarantee emotional detachment, sometimes silence only. Why delays emotional confrontation until the moment two people stand face to face again? But there is another important truth hidden in these reunions. Energy also reveals who healed and who merely avoided. A healed person carries groundedness, clarity, and emotional peace. An avoidant person who never truly processed their emotions often carries emotional tension beneath the surface, and that difference becomes impossible to ignore during real interaction. This is why so many avoidant reunions feel emotionally charged, even when very little is said aloud. The emotional history between two people remains alive beneath the conversation. Every silence carries memory. Every glance carries meaning. Every pause carries unspoken emotion, because human energy remembers what words attempt to hide. And no matter how skilled someone becomes at emotional avoidance, the truth within them eventually reveals itself in the presence of someone who once touched their heart deeply. One of the most unexpected truths about separation is that silence does not only change the person who leaves, it transforms the person who stays behind as well. The pain of being ignored, abandoned, or emotionally disconnected. Seated forces a person into deep reflection, and over time, that reflection creates growth. This is why, when an avoidant person finally returns after a long absence, the dynamic between both people is rarely the same. The version of you they left behind no longer exists. At first, the silence may have broken you emotionally. You questioned yourself constantly. You replayed memories, searched for hidden meanings, and waited for answers that never came. Their absence may have felt like rejection, and rejection has a way of attacking a person's confidence deeply. You may have blamed yourself for their withdrawal. You may have believed that if you had loved differently, spoken differently, or acted differently, they would have stayed. But pain has a strange ability to awaken people. What begins as heartbreak slowly becomes self-discovery. In the beginning, you focused on them. Eventually, you started focusing on yourself, and that shift changes everything. During the silence, something powerful happens internally. You begin learning lessons that emotional comfort could never teach you. You learn how to sit with loneliness without collapsing. You learn how to survive unanswered questions. You learn how to rebuild your peace without depending on someone else's presence. This process is painful, but it creates emotional strength. Little by little, you stop chasing closure externally because you start creating stability internally. The desperation fades. The obsession weakens. The emotional chaos settles. And in place of confusion, wisdom begins to emerge. You start realizing that your worth was never dependent on another person's ability to stay consistent. That realization transforms your energy completely. When avoidant people return after a long silence, they often expect emotional familiarity. They expect access to the same emotional version of you they once knew. They unconsciously assume the emotional dynamic will remain frozen in time, but growth changes emotional chemistry. A person who suffered deeply and healed intentionally no longer reacts the same way. You become calmer, more emotionally aware, less reactive, less dependent on external validation. And this unexpected emotional stability often unsettles the avoidant person more than anger ever could. Why? Because your growth removes the emotional imbalance that once existed between you. Avoidant individual. Owls often feel safer when they maintain emotional distance while the other person pursues closeness. That dynamic gives them a sense of control, but when they return and discover someone who no longer chases, begs, or emotionally collapses in their absence, the entire emotional structure shifts. Suddenly, they are confronted by your transformation. They notice the confidence, the peace, the emotional boundaries, the self-respect, and deep down, they realize your growth happened without them. That realization carries emotional weight because it forces them to confront a difficult truth. While they were avoiding emotions, you were evolving through them. This is one of life's deepest lessons. Pain either destroys a person or develops them. And many people who experience emotional abandonment eventually discover a level of inner strength they never knew they possessed. The silence that once felt unbearable becomes the very thing that taught them emotional independence. This does not mean the pain disappears completely. Growth does not erase emotional history. But growth changes how emotional history controls you. Instead of needing answers to feel whole, you begin creating your own clothes. Sure, through understanding, healing, and self-respect. That is why reunions after long silence feel so different. The avoidant person expects familiarity, but encounters transformation instead. They may remember the old emotional version of you, the anxious version, the waiting version, the emotionally dependent version. But standing before them now is someone stronger. Someone who discovered peace in their own identity rather than in another person's attention. And this changes the emotional atmosphere immediately. Because emotional growth creates quiet power, not loud arrogance, not revenge, not bitterness, just grounded strength. The kind of strength that no longer fears abandonment because it learned how to survive it. This transformation often becomes a mirror for the avoidant person as well. They begin seeing the emotional consequences of their disappearance more clearly. They realize the silence did not freeze your life, it forced your evolution. And perhaps the most powerful part of all is this. Your healing no longer depends on whether they fully understand what they put you through. You evolved anyway. You rebuilt anyway. You became stronger anyway. And sometimes the green. 8 as proof of healing is not hatred toward the person who disappeared. It is a calmness you carry when their presence no longer determines your emotional stability. Most people believe healing begins when the other person finally returns, apologizes, explains themselves, or gives closure. They wait for the conversation that will repair the pain. They convince themselves that peace exists somewhere inside another person's validation. But one of the deepest truths about emotional growth is this. Healing truly begins the moment you stop chasing and start standing in your own worth. As long as your emotional stability depends on someone else choosing you, responding to you, or understanding your pain, your peace remains fragile. You become trapped in emotional dependence, constantly waiting for external reassurance to feel valuable. Every delayed message feels personal. Every silence feels like rejection. Every withdrawal shakes your confidence because your identity becomes tied to another person's behavior. But healing changes that relationship completely. Healing begins when you realize your worth is not determined by someone's ability to recognize it. This realization is transformation. Rationale because it shifts your focus inward instead of outward. Instead of spending all your energy trying to make another person stay, understand, or communicate, you begin rebuilding the relationship you have with yourself. And that changes everything. When people are emotionally attached to someone avoidant, they often enter a cycle of chasing. They chase clarity, they chase reassurance, they chase emotional consistency. They keep trying harder, loving harder, understanding more, hoping their patience will eventually create security. But constant chasing slowly destroys self-respect. Not because caring deeply is weakness, but because abandoning yourself to hold on to someone else creates emotional imbalance. The more you ignore your own needs, boundaries, and emotional well-being, the more disconnected you become from your own value. This is why healing starts the moment you stop running after people who consistently run away from emotional responsibility. Choosing yourself is not bitterness, it is wisdom. There comes a moment where a person finally becomes exhausted from trying to earn love that should flow naturally. They become tired of decoding mixed signals, excusing emotion, unavailability, and carrying the emotional weight of the entire relationship alone. And in that exhaustion, awakening begins. You start recognizing that love should not constantly feel like emotional survival. You start understanding that real connection requires mutual effort. You start seeing that your peace matters too. This awareness creates a major internal shift. Instead of asking, "Why am I not enough for them?" you begin asking, "Why am I abandoning myself for someone unwilling to meet me halfway?" That question changes your life. Because self-worth grows when you stop measuring yourself through another person's inconsistency. You begin reclaiming your energy. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop forcing conversations that require mutual emotional effort. You stop shrinking your needs just to keep someone comfortable. And slowly, your identity strengthens. You begin creating peace independently rather than waiting for someone else to provide it. This does not happen overnight. Healing is not instant. There will still be moments of sadness, longing, and emotional temptation. There will be days when you miss them deeply, days when silence still hurts, days when you question your decision to stop chasing. But growth happens every time you choose dignity over desperation, every time you resist the urge to beg for clarity, every time you protect your boundaries, every time you remember your value without external confirmation. Little by little, emotional freedom develops. And something remarkable happens when a person fully steps into their worth. They stop fearing abandonment the way they once did. Why? Because they finally understand that losing someone else is painful, but losing themselves is far worse. This realization creates emotional stability that cannot easily be shaken. The need for validation weakens. The obsession with being chosen fades. And instead of trying to convince someone to see your value, you begin living as someone who already knows it. That energy is powerful, not loud, not arrogant, not cold, just deeply grounded. People who know their worth move differently. They no longer chase inconsistent behavior because they recognize that real love does not require constant emotional pursuit to survive. Healthy relationships are built through honesty, effort, emotional presence, and mutual respect, not confusion, distance, and emotion. Oceanal starvation. And ironically, when you stop chasing, you often become more emotionally attractive than ever before, not because you are playing games, but because self-respect naturally changes your presence. You radiate calmness instead of desperation, clarity instead of anxiety, strength instead of emotional dependence. The avoidant person may eventually notice this transformation too. They may sense the emotional shift. They may realize the version of you who once begged for connection no longer exists in the same way. But by then, something important has already happened. Your healing is no longer dependent on whether they return, because you discovered something greater than their attention. You discovered yourself. So if there is one truth you carry with you today, let it be this. Silence does not define your worth. Rejection does not erase your value. And another person's inability to face emotions should never become the measure of your identity. Life will always reveal the difference between those who run from truth and those who grow through it. And while avoidant people may spend years escaping vulnerability, the person who chooses healing, self-respect, and inner peace will always rise stronger in the end. Never lose yourself trying to hold on to someone who is unwilling to face themselves. Stand firm in your worth. Continue growing through every painful season, and trust that real love, healthy love, never requires you to abandon your dignity to keep it alive. Your strength is not in chasing what left, but in becoming so deeply connected to your own value that whether someone stays or goes, your peace remains unshaken. Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing this journey of wisdom and growth, and may you continue walking forward with clarity, courage, and a heart that no longer fears silence. Goodbye, and may peace follow you wherever life takes you.